with Davidson from Albertson and Davidson, and I want to have a discussion about undue influence. We've done a lot of videos and blog posts about undue influence, but I think it would be a good idea just to kind of break it down in very simple terms so that people can kind of understand what undue influence is. It's a very complex topic, believe it or not, and it's not as straightforward and easy as people might think. So technically speaking, undue influence is nothing more than excessive persuasion. So it's when somebody is applying excessive persuasion to get somebody else to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. So for example, let's say you have a parent who wants to leave all of their assets equally to their 3 kids, but one of the kids comes along and puts excessive persuasion on the parent to leave everything to them. And that really is undue influence. But you can't prove undue influence just by saying that somebody was persuaded. It takes more than that. And in fact, there's 4 different elements that you have to prove undue influence in order to prove that excessive persuasion. And those elements are vulnerability of the victim, apparent authority of the wrongdoer who's doing the influencing, the actions and tactics of the wrongdoer, and you have to have an inequitable result. Now, most people jump right to the inequitable result, and that's what they focus on. And they say, well, this isn't fair. My mom or dad never would have done this to me. They never would have intended this. That in and of itself is not going to win the day. That's one of the 4 elements, but it's actually one of the minor of the 4 elements, and most people focus on that, and that's not where your focus should be. So let's start with vulnerability. So in order to prove undue influence, you have to have somebody who's vulnerable. They're in a weakened mental state for some reason. And so every day, all of us are subjected to persuasion by our family and our friends and our children wanting us to do things. And sometimes we agree to do that, and sometimes we disagree to do that. But we're always making our own choices. So even when you choose to go along with somebody who's persuading you to do something, you're doing it because ultimately that's what you want to do. Whereas when you have a vulnerable victim, they're actually doing something that, if left to their own devices, they would not want to do. And so you think of people who are old, who have dementia, who have Alzheimer's, who's been subject to stroke, people who are dependent. And so if your food or your medication or just getting around, if you're dependent on those things by somebody else, you're going to be in a weakened state. You're going to be in a state where you are vulnerable to somebody applying excess persuasion against you. And ultimately, you're probably going to cave in because you would rather cave in and make sure that you're fed and you have your medicines than to try to withstand that persuasion. Whereas if you have an adult who is not subject to any of those things and is independent and they get their own food and their own medication, then they're not going to be as susceptible. They're not going to be as vulnerable to undue influence under the eyes of the law. The second element, apparent authority, that one's actually fairly easy. You just need somebody who has what we call a confidential relationship. So that typically is family members. It could be lawyers, doctors, therapists, clergy. It could be other people who started as friends and neighbors, but they turn into caregivers. Caregivers is a big one. So anybody who's a caregiver can have apparent authority over the victim. So you're looking for some sort of connection to the victim where they have more of a confidential relationship. So that's what that element is. It's usually not that hard to prove because typically the wrongdoer is either a family member or a caregiver. Those are the 2 biggest categories. And so they usually qualify for under apparent authority. The third element is actions and tactics. And this is really the biggest of the 4 elements because this is where you look at the wrongdoer and you ask, what did they do in order to engage in this persuasion? And usually what you're seeing is things like isolation. So they took the elder and they didn't let anybody visit, and they didn't let anybody's phone calls through, and they tried to isolate the elder because by isolating a victim who's vulnerable, it's easier to apply your excessive persuasion and get them to do what you want them to do. If they don't hear the influence of the outside world, if they don't hear the other side of the story, then it's much easier to persuade somebody to do something that they otherwise would not want to do. Other actions and tactics are things like controlling medication, controlling food, controlling their movement. And so if you have an elder who can't get around, they can't drive, they can't even walk with help, these are people who obviously are vulnerable, but those are also actions and tactics that a wrongdoer can use to help apply their undue influence. And so if I wanted to unduly influence somebody, it would be much easier for me to do that if that person knew that I controlled their source of food, or I controlled their access to medicine, or I controlled their finances. And so if I came in and I took over all the finances and I didn't let the victim see any of the finances, and now they're dependent upon me for having their bills to be paid or getting their food and medicine, obviously they're going to be a lot more open to doing what I want them to do, because now I'm in control. I'm in control of very important things in their life. And that's why actions and tactics is so important, because it's really where the wrongdoer, we can frame the argument against the wrongdoer and show exactly what they did. And you never have direct evidence of undue influence. Nobody ever steps forward and says, yep, I unduly influenced my mom. That's just something I like to do. And so what you have to do is you have to prove it by circumstantial evidence. And that usually comes through on things like actions and tactics. Because if an elder is being isolated and their food and medicine is being controlled by somebody who ultimately benefits from the estate, that's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that this person may have unduly influenced the elder. So actions and tactics is a big one. It's where we spend a vast majority of our time on these cases when we're doing discovery, doing depositions, et cetera. It's a really important aspect of undue influence. And then the fourth element, of course, is inequitable results. And that just means it was an unfair result. And a lot of people like to focus on that, like I said before, but it is an element and you do have to look at it. So if you have an estate plan where all of the children are going to receive equally for 20 years, that's the way it was, and then 2 months before the elder died, it substantially changed and left everything to just one child, that looks to be an inequitable result. That's a big change at the last moment by somebody who probably was, suffering from some sort of mental defect or age or illness. Something does not look right there. It looks to be inequitable, looks to be unfair. And so that is the fourth element of undue influence. So really what it comes down to when you think about undue influence is you have to have a bad actor who stepped in and they took action in order to force somebody into a decision that they would not otherwise make. So that's what undue influence is at the end of the day, and that's what we're trying to prove when we take an undue influence case to trial.